Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 766, and today is March 5th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I have a massive stack of articles to get through on today's show, in part because so much is happening in the world, but also I've been writing at a fairly rapid pace for the Institute, and so I got a ton of my own articles to break down on today's show. So if you want to make sure that this show, all the articles that I write, keep on coming, head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation today. We have matching funds right now, so you could double your impact. We have very generous people come in and say, hey, if you could raise $10,000 or even more sometimes, then we will donate $10,000 ourselves. And so right now, if you're head on over to the Institute and say you donate $100, you're really effectively donating $200, and that is a huge help to us. And also, we offer some great kitbats for people who donate to the Institute. We're really about spreading the message, and so that's a great way to get some of the books that we have published over at the Institute recently. All right, with that, let's jump into the show today. First up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, March 3rd. Trump says 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico will take effect on Tuesday. So President Donald Trump has said that he will impose a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico on Tuesday, saying there's no room left for the two countries to avoid the measures. Trump signed an executive order on February 1st to impose the 25% tariffs on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico, with a carve-out for Canadian oil, which will be hit with a 10% tariff. Trump paused the tariffs for 30 days after speaking with the leaders of Canada and Mexico, both who pledged to work to stem the flow of fentanyl and migrants entering the U.S. But Trump said on Monday that drugs were still pouring into our country from Canada and Mexico at a very high and unacceptable level. Reducing the flow of fentanyl into the United States is extremely difficult, since its high potency means smugglers can smuggle massive numbers of its doses in small, hard-to-detect packages. Trump also wants to use tariffs to pressure companies to manufacture in the U.S. and reduce the trade deficiencies between the U.S. and its trading partner. He has previously acknowledged that tariffs will cause pain for Americans, since they will lead to domestic price increases. And this is interesting, of course, since one of the things that Trump really, and rightfully so, raked the Biden administration over the coals for was the inflation hitting Americans. But here, his policy is going to lead to more inflation. Canada has said it's ready to hit the U.S. with retaliatory tariffs right away, and Mexico is vowing it will respond as well. Last month, Trump imposed a 10% tariff on China and said that it would increase another 10% on Tuesday, with China also vowing to respond. And so this is getting us into an unnecessary trade war. The only thing that I will say is Trump may be, I don't want to say bluffing might be the wrong word, but attempting to bully these countries into taking or doing more on the border on China, adopting more favorable trade policies to the U.S. I think these are meant to be threats and intimidation and not necessarily long-lasting policy. That being said, if he puts these tariffs on and Canada and Trump and Mexico are unwilling to bend to Trump's needs, then we could see them lasting for a very long time. All right, so this one, March 3rd, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Trump pauses all military aid to Ukraine. So we should all be celebrating this. Trump has paused all military aid to Ukraine, Bloomberg reported on Monday, citing a senior Pentagon official. The pause applies to all military equipment bound for Ukraine that's not currently in the country, including weapons that are in transit on aircraft and ships waiting in Poland to be delivered. Now, this is interesting because I know one of the things the Biden administration was trying to do to, quote, Trump-proof the aid going to Ukraine was they were setting it up so that the U.S. was transferring the aid to a NATO office, and then that aid was to be distributed to Ukraine by NATO and rather than by the United States. And so I'm sure it's not very hard to circumvent that. This is, after all, American military equipment. NATO is an alliance with the majority of its funding coming from the United States of America. And so what we say should go. But this does seem to be an indication that that Trump-proofing effort by Biden was not successful. I did read that the Russians would likely have weapons, or not the Russians, excuse me, the Ukrainians have weapons to last them till about this summer, which is what I have been saying on the show, that even if Trump turned off aid, the Ukrainians would be able to fight for several months if they want to forgo the American support and just keep doing whatever Zelensky wanted to do. So the Pentagon said the U.S. was pausing all military aid to Ukraine until the country's leadership demonstrates a good faith commitment to peace. A senior Trump administration official told Fox, "This is not permanent termination of aid, it's a pause." And so I think, just like with the sanctions, we should see this as a threat. I would love it if this was a permanent end to the war that we are talking about, a permanent end to cutting off aid. I think that's overly optimistic, and it doesn't reflect how Trump is governing during his second administration, where he's making big threats to all these countries to try to get them to bend to what the Americans want. And look, pushing Zelensky towards engaging in peace, I think, is the right thing to do. I'm just pointing out that I would not count on American aid to Ukraine being shut down, even for a few weeks. I think it's very possible, and we'll get into it as we go through this show, that Zelensky may cave and at least tell Trump that he's willing to engage in the peace process. Now, he could be doing something similar to what Netanyahu would do, which is say, "Oh, I'm engaging in the peace process, give me more weapons." But once the weapons start flowing, we're supposed to send a mediator this week. Maybe we'll send a mediator next week. Once we send that mediator, the first time they're there, it's just to listen, not to talk, and really try to drag this thing out and prevent the talks from gaining any momentum and hoping that they fizzle out. So the move comes a few days after Ukrainian President Zelensky clashed with Trump and Vice President Vance in the Oval Office, an argument that started after Zelensky questioned the administration's push for diplomacy with Russia. News of the pause comes after reports said that Trump administration was holding a meeting on Monday afternoon on the possibility of pausing military aid to Ukraine. Before the meeting, the U.S. had already frozen weapon sales to Ukraine under the State Department's Foreign Military Financing Program, which only accounted for a small portion of the U.S. weapon supplies to Ukraine. I think it's just a few $billion of the $180 billion in official aid. I want to say that it was like $300 million last year that came through the FMF program. While the Trump administration hasn't approved new military aid for Ukraine, Biden has signed off on a massive number of arms packages during his final months in office that would take years to deliver. The aid approved by Biden comes in two forms: the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which ships weapons straight from U.S. military stockpiles, and the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the Pentagon to purchase arms for Ukraine. And so I'm not sure on exactly how these programs work. I would assume the Presidential Drawdown Authority would be 100% controlled by the President of the United States. And if he, decides to transfer weapons from American stockpiles to Ukraine, that's entirely at his discretion. This is, after all, a policy that is based in the president's commander-in-chief constitutional powers. And so I would think that if Trump didn't want to send PDA funds, that would be fine. Now, USAI funds, where the weapons had already been purchased, I'm not sure if Trump could block those weapons from going to Ukraine. Of course, Congress might have something to say about it, Ukraine might have something to say about, but ultimately it would be the Pentagon shipping those weapons. And so you would assume that the Pentagon could just not do that. But we will see how long this pause lasts and how deep and severe it is, but certainly at least temporarily suspending the PDA weapons from going to Ukraine is happening, and this is causing an absolute panic in Congress. All right, so next up, I have this one that I wrote for the Institute on March 4th. Senators panic after Trump halts military aid to Ukraine. A senior Pentagon official explained to Bloomberg on Monday that the President Donald Trump ordered a pause in military aid to Ukraine. The decision has created bipartisan panic in the Senate. Unsurprisingly, most of the public criticisms of Trump's halting of aid to Ukraine came from the Democrats. A statement from New Hampshire Senator Jeanne Shaheen said, "This act of retribution against our ally, who is on the front lines defending freedom and democracy, is not only shameful, it's dangerous. I urge the administration to reverse course and remember that America's values lie in the free world, not autocrats and murderous dictators." Many U.S. politicians have invoked American values to argue that sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine was necessary. However, the country's founding fathers explicitly warned to avoid entangling alliances and searching the world for monsters to destroy, as well as wars in Europe. And so this isn't a part of American history. Several senators took to X to post their dissent to the policy. Richard Blumenthal said, he is a Democrat from Connecticut, "Trump is inviting a military catastrophe and a humanitarian nightmare, suspending aid for air defense against Russia's bloody slaughter of civilians, as well as arms necessary for battle-worn soldiers to hold the line against brutal attacks. His withholding this aid is illegal and immoral." And so he's saying that we need to send this aid in order to, make sure that there's not attacks on Ukrainian cities and that the Ukrainian military has the weapons they need to fight on. But what Trump is saying is that he wants to negotiate an end to this war. So there's no more need for these attacks on Ukrainian cities and the air defenses. And, Blumenthal is basically just arguing to keep this policy going in perpetuity. So Senator Andy Kim, he's one of the new members of the body, a Democrat from New Jersey. He took Senator Menendez's seat after, of course, he was caught being fairly openly corrupt, asserted that Trump's decision was a signal to all allies that Washington was not to be trusted. He had a statement from his office said, "The only people celebrating this decision tonight are the leaders of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. By abandoning our partners in Ukraine, President Trump has sent a signal to every one of our allies that they cannot be trusted, and to every one of our adversaries that America's word means nothing." And of course, the U.S. has poured $180, probably $200 billion into the war in Ukraine. We have significantly bled Russia in this war. Now, of course, Ukraine has paid the ultimate blood price for this, but the Russians have lost a lot. And so the idea that this is just a white flag that America doesn't stand up for anyone is just completely absurd. And notice how all these politicians are speaking solely in slogans. None of them are actually addressing any of the issues that are going on the ground. They're saying that, making comparisons to World War II and that this is good versus evil, democracy versus dictatorship, when we have broken down the show before that Ukraine certainly isn't a democracy. All right, so independent Senator Angus King joined with the Democrats who he caucuses with to claim that ending aid to Ukraine was a historic mistake. He wrote on X, "This war is not just about supporting Ukraine's people and stopping Putin's unprovoked attacks. It's about our country's national and economic interest. If we walk away from Ukraine, it will be the greatest geopolitical mistake this country has made since World War II." Some experts would disagree with King's view and argue that NATO expansion was a mistake. George Kennan, the man responsible for crafting America's Cold War strategy, explained in 1998 that NATO expansion is the beginning of a new Cold War. "I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversarially and it will affect their policies. I think it's a tragic mistake. There is no reason for this whatsoever." He added, "Of course, there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you this is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong." And so, this is really important that they like to say that, oh, like Gene Shaheen invoking the founders, Angus King invoking our post Cold War strategy to say that this is completely out of line with anything America would have ever done. Donald Trump is just this reckless bull in the china shop that's trying to destroy America and our foreign policy. When if you actually look back in statements from, former American leaders, whether that's our founding fathers, our diplomats, and men who crafted our policy during the Cold War, they are not in support of the war in Ukraine and what America has done, expanding NATO right up to Russia's border. So we also have some arguments from Republicans. This is from Tom Tillis. Look, if I'm Putin, I'm loving the pause. I'm plussing up troops at the border. I'm trying to get more drones from Iran. I'm trying to get more crap from North Korea. I'm getting the illicit money coming from China. And I'm loving the pause. I'm loving the cessation of a resupply to Ukraine. And so this is just an oversimplistic way to look at it. He's just saying, oh, Putin loves it, so then it must be bad. And of course, I'm sure Putin would like it if Ukraine lost out on the weapons that are gained from the United States of America, but that can't be America's top concern. America's top concern has to be in our own interest. As Donald Trump explained, the interest of the American people is avoiding World War III, and that's something that needs to happen by ending this war. Also, I think Tillis is kind of not really living in the reality of the military situation where Ukraine does have months worth of weapons to come. And so it's not as if tomorrow Ukraine is suddenly short on different weapons because of Trump's pause. And it's not as if Putin is probably stepping up a massive invasion overnight tonight just because of the pause. So Republican Senator Susan Collins from Maine said the decision to cut aid was a mistake. I do not think we should be pausing our efforts. It is the Ukrainians who are shedding blood, which of course is the reason that we need to ultimately end this war, is because of how much Ukrainian blood is being spilt. So House Republican Dan Bacon also criticized Trump over the pause. He said, too bad Iran, North Korea, and China are not pausing their military aid and economic support. There is an invader and a victim. This is democracy and dictatorship. There is a country who wants to be part of the West and one who hates the West. We should unambiguously be for the good side. And of course, one of the things he says in there that, and again, this is all slogans. There's no thought behind it. And so sometimes I feel almost foolish spending so much time breaking down these statements because I'm probably putting more thought into breaking them down than they actually did writing this, right? This is good and evil, and invader versus victim, democracy versus dictatorship. But when you say there's a country who wants to be a part of the West and one that hates the West, this is absolutely not true. Vladimir Putin tried for years to bring the Russian fold into the West, and it was only after NATO expansion, American and NATO military buildup on Russia's border, and just an absolute refusal from the West to engage with Russia whatsoever that ultimately led to Putin invading Ukraine. That's the whole argument that the invasion was provoked. Now, Trump did receive some support from one senator, Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, who encouraged his followers to express on X their support for pausing the aid. And I do think that this is probably a somewhat popular policy with the Americans, even if our political class hates it. All right, so Trump sent this next article from March 3rd. And this is Trump responding to Zelensky saying the end of the war in Ukraine is very, very far away. And Trump wrote on Truth Social, this is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky, and America will not put up with it for much longer. So this statement from Zelensky and the response from Trump was before, maybe is what provoked Trump to halt the military aid to Ukraine. So at Trump's address to Congress on Tuesday night, which I will spend a little bit more time breaking down later today on the new episode of the Kyle Anzalone show, so check that out if you want. But Trump indicated that he had received a letter from Zelensky that said he is ready to work with President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We really do value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. And Zelensky also told Trump Trump that he's ready to sign a deal that would give the access to revenue from Ukraine's rare earth minerals and other natural resources at any time that's convenient to you. And so I do think it does seem to me that if this letter accurately reflects the new Ukrainian position, then Trump's threat or to cut, halt, pause aid shipments to Ukraine achieved what Trump wanted it to, and I would expect that those weapon shipments would continue to flow once Zelensky signs the deal. Next up, interesting that Senator Graham has called out Zelensky for a lack of elections in Ukraine for a long time, that this was considered a Kremlin talking point, and any American who brings it up is just Vladimir Putin's useful idiot, a tool of the Kremlin. And here, Lindsey Graham, one of America's top war hawks, making this point, I think really opens it up for all Americans to talk about this without being criticized and attacked for being pro-Russian. All right, last story here when it comes to Europe. Europe plans $840 billion military spending surge. I wrote this one for the Institute on the 4th. So member states of the European Union are mulling a multi-year proposal to ramp up the bloc's military spending. The plan likely faces hurdles, including opposition from Hungary. The Rearm Europe plan was rolled out by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who warned, "We are living in the most monumentous and dangerous at times." Their proposal calls for the 27-nation bloc to increase defense spending by $841 billion, roughly the annual U.S. military budget, but the Rearm Europe plan is going to be over the course of 4 years. To achieve their surge in spending, von der Leyen said the EU was prepared to remove requirements that limit the amount of debt that each member state is allowed to hold. She believes each country could increase military spending by 1.5% of their respective GDPs. In addition, the bloc will take out over $150 billion in loans, from which funds will be doled out to member states for defense spending. The EU president argued that the boost was necessary to respond to the short-term urgency to act and support Ukraine, but also address the long-term need to take on much more responsibility for our own European security. During the first 6 weeks of his second term, President Donald Trump has caused alarm in Europe over Americans' commitment to NATO and even moved to freeze military aid to Ukraine. Following a contentious press conference between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Oval Office last week, most leaders voiced their support for Kiev. But one exception was Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who instead backed Trump after the heated exchange and voiced opposition to the Rearm Europe plan. The Prime Minister indicated he would not agree to any proposal that continued to arm Ukraine rather than seeking a negotiated end to the conflict with Russia. As most European Union action requires consensus, Budapest could scuttle the Rearm Europe proposal. Orban has been a vocal critic of Western military support for Kiev since the war began in 2022 and has largely resisted the U.S. and European sanctions campaign on Moscow, seeking to maintain relations with Russia. Aside from the Rearm Europe plan, France is considering extending its nuclear umbrella to cover the bloc. In a recent interview, Emmanuel Macron said, "I am available to open this discussion. It allows us to build a European force." He added in a second interview, "We have a shield, they don't, and they can no longer depend on the American nuclear deterrent. We need a strategic dialogue with those who don't have it and who would make France stronger." And I really think that what is happening now with NATO is a little bit more of self-fulfilling prophecy than actual issue with Americans potentially not defending Europe or committed to the NATO Article 5 mutual defense pact by this hysteria around Ukraine and constantly saying that, oh, the Americans aren't committed enough to Ukraine and tying Ukrainian security into the entirety of European security. I think it has turned Trump off somewhat from NATO. And so rather than if the Europeans were willing to cut the Ukrainians loose, or at least acknowledge that if Ukraine loses, Russia isn't even going to take the whole state of Ukraine, much less next attack a NATO member state, Trump would be much more likely to remain firmly committed to the NATO alliance. I think it's the Pat's, kind of break with Trump over the war in Ukraine that has now led to these other security concerns in Europe, which I really don't think are that serious concerns. I think if Poland was attacked tomorrow, the United States would come to Poland's aid, and same with any other member of the actual NATO alliance, just not the de facto members like Ukraine or Georgia. So Paris is the only nuclear-armed state with the European Union, though several members host U.S. nuclear weapons on their soil. French opposition figure Marine Le Pen denounced Macron's suggestion that Paris should commit to defending other nations with its strategic arsenal. She said sharing nuclear deterrence is equivalent to abolishing it, arguing that unleashing the nuclear fire cannot be separated from national and popular legitimacy. All right, next up here, moving to the Korean Peninsula, U.S. aircraft carrier arrives in South Korea as show of force. So the USS Carl Vinson arrived in South Korea on Sunday. The move was a show of force and drew sharp rebuke from North Korea. A Pentagon press release says the USS Carl Vinson, the flagship of the carrier strike group, arrived in the Republic of Korea for a scheduled port visit on March 2nd. The visit to Busan exemplifies the U.S. commitment to the region, further enhancing relationships with Republic of Korean leaders as well as the local population. Rear Admiral Michael Wuschy, the commander of the strike group, said the show of force was important to U.S. policy in the region, explaining an aircraft carrier port visit demonstrates our commitment to the alliance between the U.S. and Republic of Korea, that South Korea. Our alliance remains the linchpin of peace and security in Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula, and we are dedicated to working with the South Korean Navy counterparts to ensure stability in the region. However, the deployment of advanced military equipment to the Korean Peninsula upsets Pyongyang and often leads to reciprocal shows of force from North Korea. In response to the Vinson's arrival in South Korea, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un, said, "The United States is repeatedly committing provocative acts that ignore North Korea's security concerns and worsen the situation. The United States is openly demonstrating its intention to be the most hostile and confrontational towards the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, through these practical actions. The root of the escalation of the situation on the Korean Peninsula clearly lies with the United States and its allies, who are further intensifying their military moves to transplant NATO's infrastructure into the region and raise level of war preparedness." So Pyongyang's complaints are rooted in that the Vision and the U.S. submarine that arrived in South Korea earlier this year are capable of delivering a nuclear strike. Kim said that North Korea would continue to strengthen its nuclear programs. She explained, "The hostile policy towards North Korea pursued by the United States today, along with its actions, provides ample justification for the infinite strengthening of our nuclear war deterrence. We will not just sit back and comment on the situation." During Donald Trump's first administration, he initially took an aggressive policy towards North Korea, publicly threatening fire and fury. However, the relationship warmed after several months, and Trump met with Kim Jong-un 3 times during his administration. While Trump was unable to ink an official agreement with Kim at the end of his first term, Pyongyang limited its missile tests and was working to demilitarize its border with South Korea. After Joe Biden took over in the Oval Office, diplomacy with Pyongyang ground to a halt. Additionally, Biden worked to create a new military pact between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, which was viewed as a threat by North Korea. Throughout the Biden administration, both sides escalated their provocative military drills. Those war games and missile tests have continued in the first month of the Trump presidency. So far, we are not seeing any kind of reversal or move in the positive direction when it comes to North Korean policy from Donald Trump. All right, next up here, moving over to the Middle East, Well, first, Middle East issues coming to America. Trump administration announces steps to crack down on protests critical of Israel. So this is the woke right, right? The idea that we have free speech again in America, that we could say what we want without worrying about left-wing cancel culture. You could say that a trans woman is really a man, and you don't have to worry about being fired. You could call somebody a retard now. All these things could happen, but you can't criticize the state of Israel. That is still off limits. That is the woke American policy. So the Trump administration officials have announced several measures to suppress protests on college campuses that are critical of Israel, steps that have chilling implications on First Amendment rights. President Trump wrote on Truth Social that he would cut federal funding to colleges that allow illegal protests, a reference to the student-led pro-Palestinian demonstrations that have spread across the country in response to Israel's bombing campaign and siege of Gaza. The president also threatened agitators would be imprisoned or deported if they were foreign students. All federal funding will stop for any college, school, or university that allows illegal protest. Agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to their countries from which they came. American students will be permanently expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested. No masks, the president said. Elise Stefanik, Trump's nominee to be ambassador to the United Nations, celebrated Trump's announcement that the purpose of the order is to target protests against Israel. And so she just flat out says it. Under President Trump, colleges and universities will be held accountable. Anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hate will not be tolerated on American campuses. Promises met, promises kept. And imagine if this was the Biden administration and they were doing this for the war in Ukraine. Any criticism of the Ukrainians, well, that's anti-Ukrainian and pro-Putin, and we can't have that. You could be arrested and sent out of the country. Or if you're an American, you could be arrested for expressing your First Amendment rights. Deeply disturbing. So journalist Glenn Greenwald, a constitutional lawyer, explained in a video post on X, while cutting federal funding over political speech and protest is a violation of the First Amendment. You can take the position that there should be no federal funding of universities, or there should be an independence that is of the free speech point. Once the federal government or any government decides to offer benefits that's optional, it cannot condition the recipient of that benefit on expressing a particular view. You're affirming a particular view, or you're refraining from expressing a political view. This is basic First Amendment doctrine. So Trump's announcement came a day after Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, announced that HHS would be taking steps to combat anti-Semitism on college campuses in another directive aimed at pro-Palestinian protesters. While both Trump and his predecessor have labeled protests anti-Semitic, many Jewish students and organizations have been involved in the demonstrations. HHS said in a press release that it, along with the Department of Education and the U.S. General Services Administration, will be launching a comprehensive review of Columbia University's federal contracts and grants in light of the ongoing investigation for potential violations of Title IX and the Civil Rights Act over allegations of anti-Semitism related to pro-Palestinian protests. So Kennedy's statement said, anti-Semitism, like racism, is a spiritual and moral malady that sickens societies and kills people with lethalities comparable to history's most deadly plague. In recent years, the censorship and false narratives of woke cancel culture have transformed our great universities into greenhouses for this deadly, virulent pestilence. Making America healthy means building communities of trust and mutual respect based on speech freedoms and open debate. I mean, that's really an Orwellian statement from Kennedy there. So last week, Leo Terrell, an attorney leading the Department of Justice's task force to combat anti-Semitism, vowed he would put some Hamas supporters in jail. You see all these distortedly demonstrations supporting Hamas and trying to intimidate Jews. We are going to put these people in jail, not for 24 hours, but years. So Terrell, who was tasked with creating whose force was created by executive order signed by Trump in January, said indictments and other aggressive moves would begin soon. The DOJ said the task force would be visiting 10 college campuses to investigate alleged anti-Semitism incidents. So Terrell explained on Israeli Channel 12 News, when you see universities start losing millions of dollars in federal funding, you're going to see a change in behavior. When you see court orders protecting Jewish students via anti-Semitic students being revoked, you will see a major change. Back in 2019, President Trump signed an executive order directing all executive departments to consider the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and the organization's list of examples of contemporary anti-Semitism when enforcing Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. The IHRA's example of contemporary anti-Semitism includes drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. It also lists applying double standards to Israel by requiring of it behavior that is not expected or demanded of other democratic nations, and denying the Jewish people the right of self-determination by claiming the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And so those are obviously criticisms of Israel that we essentially make all the time on this show. I don't make World War II comparisons in general. I think they're just overdone and unhelpful and usually don't apply to the modern world. But, you know, explaining that Israel attempts to be a democratic nation that draws its borders around a population that isn't a majority Jewish and then doesn't give the non-Jews rights is a major problem and is a racist endeavor. All right, so now moving on to the actual situation in Israel. This one is for the Institute on March 3rd. 61 Palestinian detainees died in Israeli captivity since October 7th. The death toll for Palestinian in Israeli detention continues to rise. 3 captives have died in the past week. According to the Detainee and Ex-Detainee Affairs Commission and the Palestinian Prisoner Society, Khalid Muhammad Qassam Abdallah died in Israel's Medigo prison on February 23rd. A total of 3 Palestinians died that week. The Israeli outlet Haaretz has previously documented horrific abuses at the facilities. The outlet explained, detainees at the Medigo prison in northern Israel have reported cases of harsh violence and abuse carried out by prison wardens. The torture includes guards kicking, punching, hitting near their testicles, and humiliating prisoners. Some testify that prisoners who were beaten died of their injuries. The death toll of Palestinians in Israeli detention has soared to 61 since Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack, the deadliest period in the history of the Israeli occupation. Throughout the conflict, Tel Aviv has sent tens of thousands of Palestinians into a series of prisons where the detainees show signs of torture. Under the ceasefire and hostage exchange, several released Palestinians who were released from Israeli prisons have reported being beaten and tortured. Many Palestinians held by the Israelis are medical workers who were desperately trying to provide emergency care in Gaza. Last year, speaking with the BBC, 3 Palestinian medics said they were humiliated, beaten, doused with cold water, and forced to kneel in uncomfortable positions for hours, also noting they were detained for days before they were released. Additionally, the United Nations Palestinian Aid Agency, or UNRWA, said its employees were tortured by Israel to generate false confessions that the organization was tied to Hamas. A report from the agency explained, agency staff members have been subject to threats and coercion by the Israeli authorities while in detention and pressure to make false statements against the agency, including that the agency has affiliations with Hamas, and UNRWA staff members took part in the October 7th atrocities. A second report from UNRWA detailed severe abuses faced by Palestinian detainees. Ill treatment included being subjected to beatings while being made to lie on thin mattress on top of rubble for hours without food, water, or access to toilet, with their legs and hands bound with plastic ties. And Several detainees reported being forced into cages and being attacked by dogs. Some detainees, including a child, had dog bite wounds on their bodies. Detainees were threatened with prolonged detention, injury, and killing of family members if they did not provide the requested information. Some allegations of abuse have seeped into the American press. This was what one former detainee told NBC News. Our life became zero. We didn't mean anything to them. They treated us like less than animals, abusing, beating, torturing, everything you could imagine. I was sexually harassed. Still, the rampant Israeli abuse, torture, and killing of Palestinian detainees has not stopped the Trump administration from approving billions in arms to Tel Aviv, often paid with American military aid. So, Ben-Gvir calls for bombing humanitarian aid in Gaza. This is a part of Israel's plan. We'll get into here. Israel preparing hell plan for Gaza that would cut electricity and water. This one, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. So the Israeli government is preparing what they call a hell plan for the Gaza Strip that would involve cutting all electricity and water to the territory, on top of blocking food, fuel, and all other goods. That was announced by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli broadcaster Khan has reported. According to The Guardian, Khan said that the hell plan would also involve forcing Palestinians in northern Gaza to move south to prepare for the resumption of the bombing campaign. Other Israeli media reports said Israel is preparing a full-scale resumption of its genocidal war if Hamas doesn't accept Israeli terms. Hamas is urging that Israel follow the initial deal, which under phase 2 of the ceasefire was supposed to start already and would have involved the full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. After refusing to engage in talks on the second phase, Israel is trying to get Hamas to agree to an extension of the first phase of the ceasefire deal for another 42 days and release more hostages without an Israeli withdrawal. A proposal Israel said was put forward by Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. Israel has received widespread condemnation for blocking aid shipments into Gaza and collectively punishing the civilian population amid the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. But the U.S. has expressed support for war crimes and signed off on billions in new military aid ahead of Netanyahu's announcement. On Monday, Netanyahu warned things could get worse in Gaza, threatening if Hamas doesn't release all hostages, there would be consequences that you cannot imagine. An analyst from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz announced that Hamas was unlikely to agree to release more hostages without a long-term peace plan, since the captives are the group's only leverage over Israel. Israel has repeatedly violated the ceasefire and truce since it went into effect on January 19th, killing over 100 Palestinians. Israel's restrictions on aid before imposing the total siege and its refusal to engage in talks on phase 2 were also violations of the agreement. On Monday, 2 more Palestinians were killed by Israeli fire in the southern city of Rafah. I would guess the number of dead in Gaza since the ceasefire began is probably now over 150 from all those that Israel has killed. All right, everybody, that will do it for the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm sure we'll have another very full show on Friday as the news is coming at a rapid pace under the Trump administration. And of course, later today, I will be breaking down at least parts of Trump's address to Congress last night on the Kyle Anzalone show. So be sure to subscribe to that. It is the first link in the show notes page. Additionally, head on over to the Libertarian Institute. Make a donation while we have matching funds. Thanks, everyone.